The dust cloud appears on the horizon at dawn. From the castle wall, you watch it grow, a slow, rust-colored stain spreading across the green land. Then you hear it. The low rumble of hundreds of feet, the clank of armor, the snort of horses. And then you see them, the glint of spear points, the colorful snap of banners, the dark shapes of wagons hauling things that are not food. In that moment, you know the mathematics of your life have changed. Your world, once the entire valley, has just shrunk to the space inside these walls. The siege has begun. This is the story of what happens next. The attacker's grim calculus to turn that mighty castle from a fortress into a tomb. For the attacking commander, a castle wasn't just a building to capture. It was a problem to be solved. And the first step was always reconnaissance. Scouts would have been sent weeks before to assess the castle's strengths, its water sources, the loyalty of the local villages, and the state of its stores. The commander didn't just see towers, he saw vulnerabilities. Was the well inside the walls or out? Was there a blind spot on the north curtain wall? Did the lord have a reputation for being stingy with his garrison's pay? All this intelligence informed the plan. The initial approach was a deliberate show of force. The army would deploy to invest the castle, to surround it, cutting off all lines of supply and communication. This was the blockade. Historical accounts describe this as a methodical, almost ritualistic process. Patrols of hobilars, light cavalry, would sweep the countryside, burning crops, driving off livestock, and intercepting any messengers. The goal was to make the castle an island of silence and hunger in a scorched landscape. As the 14th century knight and chronicler Jean Froissart wrote, "The first victory in a siege is won in the fields around it." With the castle isolated, the attackers built their own city outside its walls, the siege camp. This was a fortified town in its own right, with ditches, palisades, and its own sentries to guard against sorties from the castle or relief armies from afar. Within this camp, the specialized work began. The most crucial tradesmen were not the knights, but the carpenters, blacksmiths, and sappers. Their workshops became the engine rooms of the siege. Now, the commander had a menu of unpleasant options, each with different costs in time, money, and blood. The cheapest, in theory, was starvation. Just wait. But time was a weapon that could cut both ways. A besieging army, often larger than the garrison, ate through its own supplies at a terrifying rate. Disease could rip through a crowded camp. A relieving force could arrive. So, while waiting was part of the plan, it was rarely the whole plan. To speed things along, they turned to psychological warfare. This started with a formal summons to surrender. A herald, protected by the laws of war, would approach the gates and offer terms. If the garrison surrendered now, they might be allowed to march out with arms and honor. If they resisted and were taken by storm, the rules changed. Mass execution or enslavement was likely. This offer wasn't just chivalry, it was a calculated move to plant seeds of doubt in the defenders' minds before a single shot was fired. If the gates remained shut, the bombardment began. This is where the great siege engines came into play. The most famous is the trebuchet, the ultimate gravity-powered artillery. Historical records from sieges like Stirling and Chateau Gaillard detail their construction on site from prefabricated components. The trebuchet didn't fire to punch a hole. It fired to demoralize and destroy. Its projectile was not always a stone. Chronicles tell of armies hurling dead horses to spread disease, beehives to cause chaos, the heads of captured comrades, or barrels of Greek fire. The goal was to make the interior of the castle a living hell, to shatter sleep, and to collapse roofs onto the defenders' heads. Alongside the trebuchet worked the mangonel and ballista. The mangonel, a torsion engine, fired on a flatter trajectory, good for battering a specific section of wall. The ballista, essentially a giant crossbow, could snipe at defenders on the battlements with huge bolts. The air would be filled with the creak of winding mechanisms, the thud of release, and the whistle of incoming death. For the defenders, there was no more terrifying sound than the collective shout of the enemy infantry heaving on ropes. followed by the deep twang of an engine letting loose. But stone could only do so much. To breach the walls, you needed to get close. This meant overcoming the castle's first line of defense, its ditches and moats. The process of filling a ditch was one of the most dangerous jobs in a siege. Attackers would advance behind mobile walls called mantelets, pushing forward fascines, huge bundles of brushwood, to dump into the ditch, or they would build covered siege sows to protect men as they worked. All the while, arrows, stones, and boiling water rained down from above. It was a battle of inches, paid for in lives. Once the ditch was crossed, the real work of the sapper began. His was the most feared tactic of all, mining. But that's a story of darkness, patience, and a very specific kind of terror. We'll get to that. If bombardment was the siege's loud public spectacle, then mining was its dark, secret heart. This was the most feared tactic because it was invisible and apocalyptic. The process, documented in the accounts of master miners, was a claustrophobic nightmare of skill and terror. Sappers, often highly paid specialists, would begin a tunnel from the safety of their own lines, digging towards a key point in the castle's defenses, usually a corner tower or a section of curtain wall. Working in shifts by the faint light of oil lamps, they used picks and shovels to excavate a narrow gallery, shoring it up with timber props as they went. The air was thick with earth and the fear of collapse. Their goal was to reach directly beneath the castle's foundations. Once there, they would excavate a chamber, pack it with combustible material, brushwood, fat, and later barrels of gunpowder, and then retreat, setting a fire to burn away the timber supports. With its support gone, the chamber would collapse, and the masonry above would crumble or tumble into the hole, creating a breach. The psychological impact was devastating. Defenders would listen for the telltale scrape of picks underground, often placing bowls of water on the floors to watch for ripples that betrayed the miners' location. Counter-mining, digging their own tunnels to intercept and fight the attackers in pitch-black, hand-to-hand combat beneath the earth, was the only defense. It was a war within the war, fought in absolute darkness. When diplomacy, starvation, bombardment, and mining had done their work, it was time for the final, brutal option, the storm, an all-out assault on the walls. This was the bloodiest gamble, a last resort when time or patience had run out. The goal was to force a breach or scale the walls and get men inside. For scaling, the tools were simple and terrifying: siege ladders. Historical illustrations show them as long, cumbersome things. Teams of men would rush forward, plant the ladder against the wall under a hail of missiles, and begin climbing. The first man up was almost certainly a dead man, facing defenders who could push the ladder away with forked poles, drop stones, or pour boiling liquids. It was a suicidal task, often given to the most expendable troops or to men desperate for the promise of extra plunder. The medieval chronicler Orderic Vitalis describes the horror at the siege of Breval. The ladders were raised, and the warriors climbed swiftly, but the defenders cast down great stones and beams, sending men falling like apples from a shaken tree. A more sophisticated but vastly more complex approach was the siege tower, or belfry. This was a rolling wooden castle, built taller than the enemy walls. It was moved on logs or wheels, painstakingly pushed across filled ditches towards the wall. Inside, it was packed with attackers. Archers on its top would duel with defenders on the battlements. When it finally thudded against the stone, a drawbridge at the top would crash down onto the wall walk, and a wave of knights would pour out, fighting for control of the battlements. The construction and movement of a belfry was a massive undertaking, and it was incredibly vulnerable to fire. Defenders would shoot flaming arrows or try to catapult pots of Greek fire at it. A burning siege tower was a towering pyre of men and money. For a ground-level breach, the weapon of choice was the battering ram. This wasn't just a log carried by men. It was often a massive timber, sometimes capped with iron, slung inside a covered wheeled shed called a cat, or tortoise. This structure protected the men swinging the ram from arrows and stones. The rhythmic, thunderous boom of the ram against the gatehouse doors would echo across the battlefield, a primal drumbeat counting down the castle's fate. Defenders would try to deaden the blows by hanging mattresses or bags of wool over the gate, or use grappling hooks to try and catch the ram's head and immobilize it. If and when a breach was made, by ram, mine, or artillery, the final chaotic phase began: the fight in the breach. This was where the attackers' numbers and the defenders' desperation clashed in a meat grinder of steel. The defenders would try to create a kill zone behind the breach, building a makeshift inner wall or barricade of timber and rubble, forcing the attackers to funnel into a narrow space where they could be picked off. The accounts of these fights are some of the most harrowing in medieval literature, describing a slick, bloody scramble over broken stone, fought in clouds of dust and smoke. But here's the twist. A successful storm didn't always mean the castle was taken room by room. Often, once the outer wall or keep was breached, the defending lord would surrender to spare the remaining garrison and himself from the sack that would follow a final, hopeless resistance. The rules of war were clear. Surrender after a breach could still mean survival. Resistance to the last man meant massacre. So what was the attacker's ultimate weapon? It wasn't the trebuchet or the ram. It was time, pressure, and the erosion of hope. A siege was a psychological marathon. The constant noise, the smell of death and fire, the shrinking rations, the sight of your comrades falling, it wore men down. A clever attacker used every tool not just to break stone, but to break spirit. The goal was to make the defenders see the next sunrise not as a new day of defiance, but as another turn of the screw. In the end, the story of a castle siege is the story of two wills clashing, one inside stone, one outside it. It was a colossal effort of logistics, engineering, and raw courage on both sides. The castle walls were a test, and the methods of attack we've explored were the grueling, ingenious, and brutal answers to that test. They shaped not just the outcomes of wars, but the very design of the castles built to withstand them. Of all the attackers' strategies, starvation, bombardment, mining, or direct assault, which do you believe placed the most psychological pressure on a medieval defender? Share your analysis in the comments below.